Horror film music from the 1980s on. In 1980, we get a very important landmark horror film called The Shining by Stanley Kubrick. And just like in the 70s, when William Friedkin, with his Exorcist, had used contemporary classical music, Stanley Kubrick did exactly the same thing and used the same composer, Krzysztof Penderecki. The Shining also features music of Georg Ligeti, another 20th century contemporary composer. It also has music of Bela Bartok and Wendy Carlos. But let's go back to Krzysztof Penderecki. Penderecki is a composer in Poland, and as far as I know, has never scored a film. But this is the second time his music was used on a very important film that many people have seen. The choices of Stanley Kubrick and William Friedkin, I should say, the sound of horror music was sort of defined. Okay, let's take a listen to a piece by Krzysztof Penderecki that was used in The Shining. This is a piece called Utrenia. The next kind of films that start coming along is where we start to get monsters. I think the invention of latex and how it looked on the screen allowed some pretty wild creatures to come about. And in 1982, we get the film The Thing. Now, the music in The Thing is pretty much by the director, John Carpenter, who, as in the 70s in Halloween, had also written the music for his films. Morricone wrote a few tracks. I don't think it was used in the film. There might be a few tracks that ended up in there. But generally speaking, the music you hear in The Thing is from John Carpenter. In 1981, the year before that, we had Evil Dead by Joseph Loduca, which I think a lot of that does have that horror Penderecki sound, but now it's music written to the film versus music written for other purposes. In 1984, we get A Nightmare on Elm Street with music by Charlie Bernstein, and that's a very synth score. It doesn't have any orchestra that I'm aware of, and it kind of has a synth sound to it. The next year, in 1985, A Nightmare on Elm Street Part 2 has a completely different composer by the name of Christopher Young, who went for this over-the-top orchestral bombast. Very cool approach, and it really put Christopher Young on the map as one of the newest horror voices in town. In 1987, Christopher Young came back with another film called Hellraiser, and in Hellraiser, he just went over the top, gothic, huge orchestral sound. Let's take a listen to the main title from Hellraiser. At the end of the 80s, we get one more film that kind of stood out for me, and that was Pet Sematary, and it introduced another unique voice by the name of Elliot Goldenthal. Goldenthal was a composer that had studied at Juilliard with John Corigliano, who's also a teacher I had worked with. And Corigliano was based on 20th century experimental music, but also combined it with a tonalism. It's a very unique combination that Goldenthal took and ran with. In the 1990s, we get kind of more supernatural and psycho killers. We get things like Silence of the Lambs in 1991 with a score by Howard Shore. Very brooding, kind of grinding pulsing chords, low chords. He did the same thing in 1995 in Seven. And when I mean the same thing, I mean the same kind of gestures, not the same music, of course. In 1992, we have Elliot Goldenthal back with Alien 3, and I think this is the movie that really put him on the map. Pet Sematary was a smaller budget film, and I just think it didn't really... When Alien 3 happened, that was a giant budgeted film that everyone was going to see, and that really put him on a global scale, I think. In 1994, he had another great film that was Interview with a Vampire. Now, he had almost no time to write that. I think he had something maybe like 2 weeks or 3 weeks to write the score for that. Earlier in 1992, we had Bram Stoker's Dracula with music by Wojciech Kilar. Now, Kilar had been working in Europe for many, many years before this, but he had not done a lot of Hollywood films. This was a very unique sounding score approach. I mean, up to this moment, we have 20th century orchestral music like Penderecki influencing the sound of horror music. With Kilar, you get a different sound. Kilar is not about over-the-top stuff like that. He's more direct. Once we get to the year 2000, we get a lot of Japanese horror remakes and pretty gory torture porn type films. One of the early ones in 2002 was The Ring, with music by Hans Zimmer. And interesting, he doesn't really take it in the Penderecki world at all. He kind of is more of a subtle and beautiful approach to this horror film. In 2002, also, another voice came on the scene for a film called 28 Days Later, and this was music by John Murphy. John Murphy kind of took I don't want to call it a pop approach, but you get drums, you get bass, you get aggressive synths in a different way that we just hadn't heard before. He did a few more of these films after that and kind of followed suit in the same style. In 2004, we get The Grudge, which is another Japanese remake with Christopher Young. I had the very unique honor of working with Chris Young on this film, and it is very much a Penderecki-style score, without a doubt. It is all that over-the-top Penderecki sound mass that, early on, Kubrick and Friedkin had used in their films and really defined that sound. Chris took it to the next level. In 2004, also, there's another movie called Saw that came out. Now, Saw was scored by Charlie Clouser. Charlie was a keyboard player in Nine Inch Nails, and what Charlie, I think, did is took the Penderecki sound, but instead of trying to do these sound mass clusters with the orchestra, he did it with synths and metals and all kinds of, sometimes very organic, but he just didn't use the orchestra. By the time we get to 2010, a composer named Joseph Bishara starting to do a lot of these James Wan films. One of them was Insidious. Another one was The Conjuring. And I still think it's got sort of that Penderecki influence. You can kind of feel that Penderecki sound. So to summarize the last few decades of horror film music, we have to look to William Friedkin and his selection of Christoph Penderecki's music to underscore his film The Exorcist. And then 10 years later, in the 1970s, Stanley Kubrick again used Penderecki's music to underscore horrific scenes in The Shining. That defining kind of what horror film music is all the way to today. And as a composer, I'm completely inspired by Penderecki. I'm not sure it was because of horror movies. I discovered his music long before that. But I've also scored quite a few horror films. I did a film in 2006 called Hack, which was a parody of many films. And I got to do a little music of Jaws, a little music of The Ring, and a few other films. 2013, I ended up doing Hatchet 3. And then last year, I did The Ghost Hunters. Besides that, I've done quite a lot of thriller films that have horror moments. Chasing Ghosts, Poker Night, and The Curse of Sleeping Beauty all have kind of horror elements. With that, I think I'm going to finish this video. If you like what you heard, click the like button below. If you like the channel, subscribe and come back next week for another video on film music. Thanks for listening.